What's up, guys? Welcome to Lawsplaining the Interwebs. I am your host, Nick Rekieta of Rekieta Law, a small law firm in central Minnesota. This video is a continuation on the nature of, okay? So the last video was on the nature of free speech, and today is on the nature of rights versus freedoms. All right, so in the last video, I made the claim, and I stand by this claim 100%, that freedom of speech literally means freedom from consequences. If you have a consequence to your speech, you don't have freedom. All right. Now, some people, I guess, who maybe didn't watch or just didn't listen closely, mistook that as some sort of moral judgment against whatever system of speech that we have. All right. So they said, well, or it was like a personally offensive to them, the idea that we don't have freedom when we clearly don't have freedom, right? If you think we have free speech, just ask Papa John. I think he might disagree with how free his speech was. But, sorry. The idea that freedom is limited is just, it's a funny idea to me. Like saying, I'm free to do this, except, or but, or not when, then you're not free. You're not free. Free means free from restraint. And think about it this way. If you think that, if the government isn't going to kill you for it, right? Like that's the idea people have gotten in their heads, is free speech isn't freedom from consequences. They mean, well, you still have free speech because you're not getting arrested or you're not getting put in prison. But that's not what freedom is, right? Or you're not being actively restrained from saying something. Well, that's not freedom. That's not how we measure freedom. That's not what freedom is. Because if you use that measurement, then you take slaves back in the early 1800s, and any slave that wasn't shackled to a wall was free then, right? They had freedom because they could leave. They could run off the plantation. I mean, sure, they might be chased down and killed or tortured or punished in some sort of way, you know, but they were free to leave. They just chose not to. Like, that's the logic that we're going with here. If we say that some private entity enforcing a restriction on our freedom amounts to still having freedom. No, it doesn't. What people are talking about in these cases, and what's happened, is that over the past several generations of people, really, we have started to conflate the idea of rights with freedom. Because you have a right to the freedom of speech. So people start to mix these two things in their minds. They say, oh, a right is a freedom and a freedom is a right. But that's not really true. So let me recap quickly on freedom, and then I'll move on to what rights are and how they're different, because it's really kind of important on how we frame this stuff. So freedom, again, is a value. It is an abstract and it is absolute. There is no spectrum of freedom. There is no more free or less free on any particular thing, like on a freedom. I mean, one society might have more freedoms than another society, or more access to freedom or something like that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying there is no more free speech and less free speech. There's just free speech and then not free speech, right? Like, that's freedom. That's how it goes. You either have free movement and not free movement. There's no like partial free movement except if there's an except or a but or whatever, you don't have freedom, okay? And yes, I understand, and you should too, that might mean that freedom in any particular thing might be unrealistic. It's unattainable. It's something that can't happen. And that's okay. Like, that's fine. We have to look at freedom in this way because we have to make sure that we're always measuring against the absolute. Because if we're talking about encroaching upon that freedom, The encroachments need to be as small as possible, and so we have to have them start from the very edge of the spectrum, all the way to the side that is freedom. Anything after that, we have to encroach from the origin, not from some other barometer, or we lose more freedom than we need to lose, okay? So that's why it's important to frame freedom that way. Rights, on the other hand, are different. Rights are defined differently than freedom. We talk about them in the same way, but they're very distinct things. So a right is a just claim to something, a claim under justice. Now, that doesn't have to be an ordered system of justice. There are all sorts of different orderings that we can use, both formal and informal, and do use with frequency. But rights are merely claims to something. A property right is a claim of ownership. Now, if you pick up any object near you and you say, whose property is this? Who has a right to this property? It's probably you, right? Unless you have roommates or something like that. But like if I go, okay, so here is this bottle of whiskey. This is my bottle of whiskey. I have a claim to this. But this bottle of whiskey has been written on by someone, a guy named Jacob, who's really cool. And this bottle of whiskey was bottled and packaged somewhere. It was sold by a retailer. There's a chain of people who have some sort of claim to this whiskey. If I left this out on the street, which I never would do, and someone walked by and picked it up, they'd have a claim to it. Now, if I had dropped it accidentally, left it by accident, and I came back to that person and said, hey, that's actually mine, you know, and it was reasonable amount of time or whatever, they could recognize my claim, my right, my property right in that bottle of whiskey and return it to me. But if I left it there for someone else to take, like with a sign that said free whiskey, and then they came up and took it, and I said, well, actually, that's mine, I want it back. Well, no, I've given it up, right? I've relinquished some of my claim. There's a whole competing chain of claims. Like if I were no longer around, who would have this bottle of whiskey? Someone else has a claim to it. Maybe it's Jacob who wrote on it. Maybe it's the bottling company who, or maybe it's the retailer who sold it, or like I said, the bottling company or the distiller. All of these people could assert their claim of ownership, and one person wins. That's a right, okay? So if we bring this back into speech, for example, you have a right to the freedom of speech, and so does everybody else. But those rights can be abridged by a better right, a better just claim. Or even, it doesn't, I guess better's like a judgment. No, we'll stick with better. I want to say something, but that would cause another person damage. So then my right to free speech, my just claim, is now questionable, right? Is it still just? Do I have the right to lie about someone to cause them damage? In most societies, we'd say no. That'd be slander or libel, for example. Defamation. You don't have a right to defame someone. Because their reputation they have a right to, you know, a fair representation of themselves, and that right supersedes your right to free speech in that instance. You have competing claims to something, and when we weigh it out under an ordered system of justice, we structure out which claim is going to win most of the time. This is how lawyers work, right? This is how the law works. We have a set of rules about where those just claims fall on the hierarchy of claims. We order our rights, and where those rights end and begin are where people, I guess, how people interact in some sort of ordered society. Now, it's important that rights can be abridged by non-legal processes as well. You don't have just a legal protection of right. If someone is actively stopping you from doing something and they're infringing upon your right to something, you may have a claim against them. Like, this is the civil world we live in, right? If someone is Well, like let's say you have a right to the freedom of movement and you're walking around. Well, someone else may have a property right, and if your freedom of movement enters onto that property without permission, you're trespassing and you can be removed from the property. You can be punished. You might have to compensate them for something. We have ordered a series of rights, and we have said that property rights supersede the right of travel when they come into conflict. Now, not all systems would do that. Some informal societies or even formal societies might say, no, people have a right to walk wherever they want, so long as they're not entering a building. So then you would have different levels of property right that would compete with rights of travel in different ways. The whole point in this is that rights are just claims that can be ordered and compete against each other both naturally and unnaturally, like both just kind of in our social interactions and in ordered structures that we develop. Freedoms do not. Freedoms are absolute. If you have free speech, there are no consequences for you. If you have consequences, you don't have free speech. If you have free movement, you can move anywhere you want with impunity. If you can't, you don't have free movement. Again, these are not moral condemnations of societies that limit those freedoms, or more appropriately, limit the rights to those freedoms. Those societies will choose their limits and how they do it. But it's important that we frame things in the proper way so that we know we're not infringing upon freedom to any degree more than we have to. We should always push towards the ideal of maximum freedom with minimum interference just for the sake of living in ordered society. And how we do that, of course, is open for debate, and people are going to have very different opinions on how to get there. But it's important that we're framing things in the right way, or we will lose sight of how we protect our freedoms and how we order our rights. So hope you guys found this interesting and insightful, and I hope it's, again, helping stimulate the idea of how we consider rights and freedoms and how we order our society and how we order our interactions with each other. Thank you for watching. More of these are on the way. Have a good one.